I guess we can just start. So the topic of the lecture today is slider gameplay, and I guess also subtitle like slider mechanics. So in the first part of the lecture, I'm just kind of going to talk about like how sliders work, like a lot of things about how about the specifics of how they work, and then how those mechanics affect gameplay or can affect gameplay. Yeah. So first of all, let's start with a little definition from the OS wiki about what a slider even is, which already kind of has some information included about how they work. So the wiki says a slider is a hit object in OSU which consists of a slider head, a slider body, and a slider tail. Once the approach circle reaches the slider head's border, like with hit circles, the player must click/tap the beginning of the slider and then keep the button pressed. Follow a moving ball called a slider ball along the track until the slider tail is reached. If there's a reverse arrow, the player must follow the slider ball back along the same path. Sliders with reverse arrows are called reverse sliders. A slider's speed is defined by its slider velocity. Some people also call this SV. And the current timing section's slider velocity multiplier. It's also influenced by base slider velocity and BPM, but let's ignore that for now. Slider ticks are small circles that appear in regular intervals along the slider body. The player only fails to completely clear a slider if the cursor is outside the slider ball range defined by the circle around the ball, the so-called slider follow circle, or the mouse button is unpressed while the slider ball is passing over a slider tick. Being outside the slider ball range or releasing the button at any other time will not yield any penalty, though it's not advised because you could easily result in a slider break. Passing over a slider tail or a slider tick will give a small health boost, usually just barely enough to keep the health bar where it is. Okay, so that was a lot of information. You can just reread that in the wiki on what a slider is. You can probably look it up yourself. But from this description already, we can sort of like abstract some basic and a bit more complex concepts from how a slider works. So probably all of you know like the basics. You have to aim and click the slider head. You have to keep holding down the key throughout the slider body and follow it until the end. I assume that should be kind of obvious. Where things get more interesting is when we consider what the actual minimum requirements are to get a 300 or break a combo, or not get fully a full amount of combo. That's possible. First of all, it's possible to full combo a slider without getting a 300, apparently. The minimum requirements to FC are just to click the slider head within the hit window of getting a 50 full circle. So sliders don't, at least with Score V1 or the current scoring system, sliders don't need to be clicked accurately. They just need to be clicked accurately enough where you don't get a miss. So which would be defined by the hit window for when you get a 50 versus a miss with a circle, which is dependent on the overall difficulty value of the map. Okay, another thing would be when you click too early or too late, select that you will actually miss but still follow the slider, you will break combo and get a 100. When you don't initially click at all but still follow the slider, you will also break combo and get a 100. When you click within the right hit window but release too early, you won't get a 300. Although if you release after having followed all the slider ticks and reverses, you will still have seen. When you click outside the hit window and release the slider without having followed all slider ticks, you will get a 50 and break combo. That was probably a lot of information. I can I might link a document later, and maybe even have a picture that I can break up of all of that in just a simple table, sort of. Might be useful.
Yeah, but I think it's a lot easier to kind of understand with a table.
You don't need to click a slider accurately almost at all to play it perfectly. You will not even get a 100 if you click it in the hit window of a 50. Yeah, that's the table that was meant. So to FC and get a 300, you must basically click on time within the right hit window and follow all the slider ticks. You will get a slider break if you click way too early or too late, but follow all the slider ticks, etc. Maybe I can even show some weird cases quickly. Let's open up a semi-random map. Like, let's say I put just down the slider here. Does it even have a tick? I think it doesn't. Oh, it has a tick right here at the end. Maybe yeah, that should be fine. So let's say I play the slider. Maybe remove more objects around it. And more easily do it. Let's say I don't click the head at all, I just move along. So I just got a 300 even though I didn't click the slider at all. I was just holding down the key while going over the slider tick, etc.
Got a 100 for just hitting the slider tick and slider end.
Yeah. Now, what happens if I just click the head and then I just stop? I get a 50. I probably break combo. If I just click once, and then what should be possible also is that I click down on the head on the right moment, and then I release my key, which you sadly can't see, and then I just hold it down again when the slider tick comes up. Bit hard. Okay, yeah, see, I got a 300 even though I released my key mid-slider. So, that's kind of a thing to keep in mind. So overall, what's kind of the case with accuracy with sliders or just combos in general is how accurately you hit doesn't matter at all. It's all about like how many parts of the slider you've followed correctly, whether you followed the slider tick where you hold down the key until the end, where you hold down the key when the slider tick comes up, whether you've clicked when the slider head came up, etc. There's also this stuff about like how say you can FC a slider but have a little bit less combo if you click on time, you follow all the slider ticks, but you release the slider too early. I think a lot of players call that like dropping slider ends or something. You might have heard of that. A lot of these things are not too relevant for mapping. The most relevant things are probably that you don't have to follow a lot of a slider, and there's this like accuracy leniency that you don't have to click very accurately, assuming this current scoring system.
Something players might notice is there is a difference between a full combo and a perfect full combo. If you ever play a map and on the results screen it says perfect over the HP chart, that means that you didn't lose any slider ends. If anyone ever wondered what that meant.
Yeah.
But if you do lose some slider ends, it means it's not technically a max combo, so it doesn't show the perfect. Even though you might not have broke, it's not the maximum combo you can achieve.
Do you know whether a map to be rankable has to whether it has to be possible to max combo it or full combo it? I think there is
No.
no rule about that.
There's no rule. That's like a prime example of Monstrata's. Is it triple play? The one with the really fast sliders, like the really fast slider stream stuff.
I think the fast slider stream stuff is triple play, or it's when you see the Camilla song when you see it or 727. one of those.
Yeah, so it's always, I mean, that's kind of like an edge case. I'd probably personally disagree that that should be rankable. That should be rankable. Um, but yeah, you can get away with some interesting stuff with sliders just because, well, slider ends aren't the most crucial things to hit. So you can get away with some like strange ideas and strange gameplay with them.
Yeah, can be important to keep in mind when designing your map. That, technically speaking, it doesn't have to be possible for the player to hit all the sliders. I don't know if it must be possible to FC the map. I think it must be possible for Auto to at least get a SS. I don't know. I think
I
that
don't
might be one
I don't
requirement.
believe that's the case either, actually. Because Kreutz has I'm just gonna quickly look up the name of the map. Yeah, Kreutz's Last Resort is another example of a map which can't be SS'd. The ending pattern of that has some like really fast sliders. Do you have the map, Kreutz's Last Resort?
I think so.
I don't think Auto can SS that.
Uh,
Oh no, you don't
no,
have it.
I don't. Sadly, I don't have it. I guess I can download quickly.
So that's the end.
But
The ending of that has some like ridiculously fast sliders, and Kreutz has made it in a way where it means there's like a lot of cursor movement for the climax of the song, but no human player could like actually hit all of those sliders accurately, maybe some of them. So it's the last div.
is it? You know around where it is?
It's like at
I
the
guess.
end. So yeah. I don't think Auto can play this.
Well,
Did
I
Auto
guess
play it?
it seems like Auto can play it. Maybe not. Maybe it's not that pattern that Auto can play. I don't know. I
Or
think it can
maybe
play the
maybe it was
dream or something.
nerfed. There was a point in time where Auto couldn't play that pattern. I'm fairly sure. Because that
Could
pattern
be.
was like quite controversial when the map was qualified.
Yeah, I see that makes sense. Um. Okay, so that's sort of a thing about like combos, etc. There's like a wiki definition as well of what sort of apparently classifies as a slider break. Um, apparently, it's a slider break can occur in three different ways. Either one, missing the head of a slider whilst still completely or partially completing the body. So if you like what I did, where I just don't click the slider head at all, I just hold down the key and hover over the slider tick and the slider end. I would probably break combo on that. Um, the second one would be letting go of a slider at any point of its duration. Uh, I think that one is actually a lie. It's like if you let go while there's a slider tick going on, you can. Or do you break combo if you just let go? I don't remember. Um,
Uh,
might have to test that later.
yeah.
It could be that you do break combo. I just not quite remember. Third one would be not collecting all of the slider ticks, which yeah.
Ah,
So
sorry. Yep. Just you only you only slider break by letting go of a slider during one of those like three critical judgment windows, which is either the hitting of the slider head, any slider ticks, or slider end. If you do completely let go, as long as your cursor is held down and within the slider follow point during any slider ticks and slider end, that's all that matters. So you can like completely leave the slider and let go of your cursor and still remain full combo and full accuracy.
mm, yeah, I see. So it's you have to stay within this follow circle, but you can release the key, or you can also go out of the follow
You
circle.
can
What
go
was
out
the
of the follow circle as well. Yeah.
okay? Mention. Oh no, we just mentioned the follow circle. We said, or at least the definitions earlier, kind of mentioned the term following a few times, but maybe be a bit more specific about what is really meant by following a slider. So we kind of mentioned earlier a little bit, and maybe some of you already kind of noticed that you don't have to literally perfectly follow a slider. There is this circle around the ball. Maybe I can even show it. Yeah, here this little yellow ball here. It probably looks different in a default skin or whatever skin you have. With some skins, it also varies in size, which can maybe negatively influence how you're mapping. So be careful around what the size of this is in your skin, I guess. Always the safest to just use a skin that's either the default or basically just almost the same as the default skin.
So the follow circle here is the large gold ring that's around the end of the slider one. There's
Yeah,
like two parts of a slider follow circle. There's like the actual circle itself, which is the gold or yellow part, and then the slider ball itself, which is on the track of the slider, which is like the same size as the slider end. And yeah, a lot of skins, quite a few skins actually don't even have the yellow part, like the larger circle, and they'll just have the ball. I'd strongly recommend not mapping with those skins.
yeah, those skins are nice for playing for me, for example, personally. I don't care about this ring when playing, but when mapping, it's definitely useful, even if you might not even need it necessarily if you just have a good understanding of sliders, but it's definitely helpful. To maybe better illustrate how exactly this kind of stuff works, I can first of all show this little picture here in Event General, which is a picture of the cursor being just inside the slider follow circle. So to follow a slider basically and not break any combo, you just have to stay within this ring, roughly speaking, when there are slider ticks and slider ends and slider heads. Yeah, or at least when with the slider ends, you wouldn't necessarily break combo if you left the circle while you followed all the slider ticks, and there's only the slider end left, but you would uh, have the one combo less. You wouldn't get the max combo. So this kind of thing is really relevant for mapping because it influences a lot of how sliders can be played. Obvious example would be if I just come up with a random kind of slider in this map. Like say I just make this epic looking slider. I don't have to perfectly follow the slider at all. I can just like, I play it, I can just go, oh, that's a bit fast. Yeah, you can sort of see, I can kind of follow it, but just like moving from left to right. It's a bit more difficult. Maybe I can reduce the SV and then it's easy. Let's go. Okay. Well, I'm so bad, I think. But I think you might get the point.
Yeah, so the shape doesn't because there's like such a large area where you can still hit these slider ticks. The shape doesn't need to be accurately followed, and you can see by the cursor trail, the trail of the cursor is nothing like the shape of the slider. That's an interesting slider.
Yeah. Would also be interesting example. You could see, I mean, I partially didn't follow it well, but you can sort of play this slider, but kind of just like clicking down and then not moving at all. Well, yeah, that's kind of, so that's the thing that this type of slider leniency does. This is often called slider body leniency, which is a different kind of leniency than the one we sort of talked about earlier, where the head doesn't need to be clicked accurately, where you can basically miss the hit window, get a click it into hit window of a 50 and still get a 300 in the current scoring system. That's often called slider head leniency or slider timing leniency. And besides those two, there's also a third one. And this one's gonna be maybe funny. I'll show a really funny example. So you see, I think all of you can see this epic slider, I hope. Fun question. Where does this slider end? Where does the cursor have to last be on the screen? Can someone just like roughly pinpoint like top right, bottom left, top left, whatever?
If anyone says bottom left, I'll be very concerned.
Does anyone have any ideas where the slider ends? Any other ideas? Does anyone else know where the slider ends? Can't just be one person, right? Okay.
To give people maybe a bit of a clue, to give you maybe to guess better, the map creator literally had to put in the description where the slider ended.
Well, I mean, something that you might be able to expect is that why you, how to put it like this, you might be wondering, why am I asking such a stupid question? Like, that seems like a really stupid question. It's obvious. The slider end should be here, right? That's where the slider ends. So, so that would be a reasonable thing to assume, but this game is kind of a little bit different. Apparently, some people have like tested out how this kind of thing actually works, and apparently the actual end of a slider is, or it's calculated 36 milliseconds before the point where it actually ends. So this is where the slider would end usually in the timeline, like around this point, which is 36 seconds and 72 milliseconds. If you click on this number down here at the bottom left, you can like open up a window and insert a different number. So what I can do is I do 72 milliseconds minus 36, which is just 36, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the actual slider end is first of all, in the timeline, it is exactly here. It's a little bit earlier, a little bit before you could release the slider earlier. And then also it's here, where my slider ball is on screen. That's the last place you need to be with your cursor to complete the slider. So why is it so far away from the actual slider end? One reason is that this slider is extremely fast. It's like that's pretty fast, right? What is the actual? It's like 170 BPM, 3.5 base slider velocity, and then the slider velocity of this slider is 8.19. That's like, I think that might be the fastest slider that I've ever seen in the game. It could be that's probably some unranked map where it's even faster. But because of that, there's obviously more time being traveled, or the ball travels through the slider body faster. So the actual position just happens to be, if you go 36 milliseconds back, it happens to be here at the top right. And when people actually play this map, the kind of thing they do to play the slider is they click the head, they go to this slider tick here, down here, then they go to the slider tick here, and then they move the cursor to this position instead of to the bottom right to play it correctly. It's about like this. Yeah, I just got a 300 on the slider. It actually kind of surprised me because usually I'm kind of bad at playing this one.
So kind of to put it into other terms, the slider end isn't actually where the slider end visibly appears. It's actually 36 milliseconds before the slider end. This is only really going to be applicable to very high slider velocities. Like you usually don't have to worry about this kind of thing. It's when you get to these like kind of ridiculous slider velocities that you need to be cautious of this kind of stuff.
I don't know if it is the same case in laser. I believe it might be. I'm not quite sure. I think definitely the accuracy thing is different in laser. Like you have to click sliders accurately, but you don't have to. You still have to only stay within the slider ball to play them. One way where this type of leniency also comes in, which is called slider end leniency, is that it seems to affect sliders in the way where you can kind of like exit them a little bit earlier, so it makes spacing out of them easier to play, which some people abuse in ways by basically making spacing out of the sliders higher to compensate for it, to make the movement kind of feel the same, even though you can sort of like release the slider a bit earlier. We might talk about that a little bit more later, but another interesting thing that you might have noticed is that the slider seems pretty ridiculous, I assume, to a lot of people, because it's like this fast, and to play it you have to almost not follow it at all. You really have to like just do this. Now, can someone guess, is this rankable? Does anyone think this is not rankable? Does anyone think this is rankable? Please give some opinions. Yeah, that is a good answer. It literally is from a ranked map. This is also a banger map, so this is Glacier Fall by Sakura Bus, map by Scap Domino. And the map has like 2 sliders like these. And another one in like the chorus section. Let me find it. Which is also kind of funny. Well, there are also sliders like these. Where's the funny one? Oh, this one. I don't exactly know how you play that one, but it's probably also kind of like a thing where you
It's
just like hover over the sliders.
yeah, it's only has one slider tick on it.
I don't know what the slider end is. So obviously, a lot of people will only really play sliders the way that say I'm just doing right now in this map. In like really extreme cases. With like normal maps where the sliders are kind of just like, say these here, you won't, or even this slider, you won't just click on the head. Or most people won't just click on the head and then just move to this next slider tick or something, even though they, theoretically speaking, maybe you could do that. But for these extreme cases, it's kind of very important to understand how those kind of sliders really work. And then we're obviously also going to talk a little bit about implications for regular gameplay of these 3 types of leniency: the accuracy leniency, the slider body leniency, and the slider tail / end leniency.
When it comes to like higher star maps or higher or maps aimed at higher ranked players, it is kind of more relevant for not even super fast sliders when it comes to this kind of following slider ticks, because at least myself personally, and I'm like 15k rank, at least for myself personally, if I come across a slider, perfect example, like Notch Hell, if I come across a slider where where the slider path is kind of maybe not super clear, a lot of players will kind of do have this ability to just follow slider ticks rather than attempting to follow full sliders. So it is beneficial in maps for multiple reasons, which I'm sure we'll get into some of the other reasons later. But there is beneficial to kind of take into account where the slider ticks may be placed along your slider.
Yeah,
I think
especially if,
I think the clearest examples are like the ones in the end, like the last Ki. Yeah.
yeah, instead of following the slider, there's like this one video by GN where he like plays the map entirely with a skin where slider bodies are just invisible, and there's only like really big slider ticks, so he's just like only following those. Now,
Yeah.
as mentioned before, that kind of gameplay seems to only really be important if you have relatively fast, longer sliders, or super fast sliders that are like just impossible to play otherwise.
Or sliders with very hard to read slider paths
Yeah.
If I play a map, if I'm sight reading a map and then this slider pops up, I won't even try to. Maybe I would read this one because it's not that complicated. But if I do hit a slider head and I'm kind of unsure where to go with the next slider, I just look for the slider tick.
Yeah.
And
So
I do believe quite a few, at least at some level of gameplay, players play like that.
yeah. Uh, let's get a bit more into some more practical examples. So we're just going to talk about how all the three types of leniency sort of affect gameplay. The first one is sleight ahead leniency. So there's been a bit of discussion about this kind of thing, whether it's really relevant, because in laser and in tournaments, it's like technically speaking not a thing. Score 2 in tournaments removes the accuracy leniency. It makes it so you have to click sliders accurately, and laser has that basically also built in as well, where the standard mode of scoring is the one where you can get 50s and 100s on slider heads if you don't click accurately enough. So it might not be relevant in the near future, like I don't know. We won't go too much into whether this is a good thing or whatever. There's like a lot of videos about that I also linked in the document. You can watch those. Maybe you've already watched them, whatever. But we can talk basically about 3 or 4 cases of where slider accuracy leniency is sort of used in mapping. So the first one is like sudden beginnings of maps. Maybe give an example like this one. I just picked this for the song. So one thing you might notice about this song is that the first sound basically happens without any prior sound. Something that's kind of difficult about that one is that basically the player has no like real reference before that of when to exactly click. Besides the slider approach circle, which I personally think a lot of people can just read the approach circle. It's kind of fine. But something people have done to sort of make this a bit easier is just something you can do is just use a slider in the beginning. Like if you just place this one down here or something, the player would already not have to click accurately. They can be slightly off, and then as soon as they play the next object, they will kind of have the reference for what BPM is and what to click, sort of. Another thing that can be done alternatively is using the countdown feature in the song setup, which basically nobody uses anymore. And I personally don't even think it's really that effective, if that makes sense. Do you feel like the countdown has ever helped you, Jordan?
Well, a lot of skins have the countdown disabled, so
Yeah.
it's kind of not really. I wouldn't advise using that.
You think it's actually an issue um, worth using a slider for if there's no prior sound?
Um,
Like,
yeah, like using a circle when there's no prior sound, it's just unfair, really. Even though a lot of maps do it, it's unfair and it can be done better because the player's not been able to kind of like internalize the metronome for the song, so to say. Expecting someone to accurately hit within a small amount of milliseconds in a rhythm game where there hasn't been any rhythm is you can't really expect someone to do that. It just means if a player does want to try to get like a good score on your map, they just have to spam retry the start pretty much until they do get 300.
yeah,
Or
or they just,
I
or we
mean,
just
you can make the argument that oh well they should just read the approach circle, but that's not how this game works.
I think ironically enough, that's kind of the perspective I personally have. I'm like, I think it is sort of fine if the first object is just a circle, or if it's fine with Scotty too. But that's also partially because I think it's not necessary for someone to like SS the map on site read. I mean, if someone can SS the map on site read, let's go for them. I think if someone maybe initially drops 100s on that, that's or maybe even a 50. That's kind of acceptable, sort of. Although there's an argument to be made that using a slider currently, or maybe even a countdown, is a better solution potentially. Okay, so that's a kind of basic case. Next one will be rhythm simplification. Me and John kind of talked about that one already in a different lecture in our class, which is also talked about in the document that we've written about, that I've written about it. We've written about it.
By the way, all our previous lectures are available in MHS Archive.
True.
So if you did want to see another video about rhythm simplification, you can actually see it there as well.
Yeah, but let's just give an example. For example, let's say we have this map with almost all of them. It's kind of just like basic 1/4, 1/2, half beat, full beat, quarter beat, etc. And then suddenly this comes up. Just like it just comes up out of nowhere. There's this 1/3 part. So one way to simplify this would obviously be that, or first of all, one thing you could do is just not simplify it at all, which, depending on the diff, this is maybe it's even insane or hard. You should probably simplify it. Another option would be to use reverses like this. The thing that some people don't like about that one is that it's just kind of boring, and you're sort of just completely removing the room complexity from the map entirely, even though the song is doing this. So something that some people do is like, say they make patterns like this. In this case, sort of, although there's some clicks on the purple tick still, or maybe even if it's slightly changed like this, that also works. Player still has to like, player still has like this moment where they can click down on the actual rhythm, but because sliders are more lenient, they could have also just accidentally clicked wrong. Just clicked it as a bit 1/4, and then they kind of get accustomed to it. So that's like a kind of nice way where you can simplify rhythm move where the player might still play it correctly, and even if they don't play it fully correctly, they will like still get a perfect score in the current scoring system. This also works with other complex rhythms, like you could do it with 1/5 as well or something. There's nothing really stopping you from doing it. Or 3/8 or something, and basically any kind of rhythm. You can kind of just add more slides into it, to make it more lenient to play, to make it so the player that doesn't necessarily get 100s or 50s and everything when there's an unexpected change in the rhythm of a song. Yeah, the main argument, I guess, for using something like that over just circles would be if it's in a song where it's completely unexpected.
Yeah, I mean another way in terms of, I mean you can also think of the rhythm simplification. You can also use it in terms of like rhythm introduction. So that would be like if a 1/3 section is starting, just to get the player used to that kind of rhythm, you could use like a 1/3 reverse slider and then just use 1/3 circles. Because you don't need to click the reverse slider, you're kind of introducing the player that that rhythm's going to start. That's another good way to do it as well. That's kind of a way of doing it without reducing the rhythm complexity much, while still keeping it fair. So this is the second half of the lecture. We did have to split it up into two parts because of some issues with recording with the first half. So we're going to be starting this next half off with going over changes of timing and how slide head leniency can be used to make timing changes more simple.
Yeah. So or last time we kind of talked a little bit about how it can slider head leniency or accuracy leniency in general can just be used to make complex rhythms a bit more easier. Although that's not something that everyone wants, and some explicitly would avoid it. Maybe the last kind of two cases, or use cases for slider accuracy leniency are probably the most important ones. First one would be, if you can see the timeline I have here down below, there's a lot of red lines. So a lot of timing changes on basically almost every third note. In cases like these, or just songs where say it is for the most part 150 BPM, and then while there's maybe even an intense section going on where there is a lot of difficult gameplay, and it then suddenly switches to 120 BPM or something. For cases like these, it's not really feasible for the player to kind of predict or react to that on the first object where the tempo change happens. So what a lot of people have been doing is basically using sliders to make these more difficult and unpredictable changes in timing a lot more manageable. Like if you look through this map, basically almost every object is just like a slider with some occasional circles. But even then, those circles are like, say, already within the timing of this one. Like there's no red line on a circle or something like that. That kind of is here, but it's like right at the end. In most cases, it's just sliders to really make the a lot more easy, manageable to play. Otherwise, the player would need to have a kind of level of, I think even if you are really, really accurate at reading approach circles, you might need even a little bit of memorization to like play this. Or you need to like actively expect this
Yeah.
level of timing difficulty.
Now, this is not exactly an example you're going to come across a lot. There's not many maps that have this many timing points unless it's something like a live recording that's not really been electronically produced. But it helps with switching between different BPMs and such, kind of similar to a point I made about the rhythm simplification, with using passive rhythm to introduce different rhythm snaps like 1/3 and such. You can also use starting timing sections off with a slider, can also kind of help passively introduce BPM changes, which makes them a lot easier to play as well and adjust to.
I was wondering whether one of the diffs on this set was doing it, but it's just like a spinner that goes into the next BPM change. I guess you could just imagine this song is like for the most part it's 150 something fucked up weird BPM, and then it goes to 131 something fucked up BPM. um, you could just hypothetically imagine that this song, like say, it just suddenly changes the BPM while there has already been like something mapped here or something. If it were to just suddenly happen, um, having a circle as the first object definitely makes it a lot more unpredictable, and players will most likely, if they sight read the map, guaranteed get like a 50, unless they are just really, really focused, which I mean, if you don't expect this on sight read, which I think most people wouldn't, then you're just not gonna play it accurately. Well, I mean, I think that's relatively straightforward, that use case. You can just use basically because sliders because you don't need to click them accurately currently in SCOV1. You can use them at least for the first few nodes of a BPM change to make it more manageable.
Yeah.
Um,
And the last thing to really go over with slide ahead leniency, whilst of course you would think you can do pretty much anything with slider heads and rhythms at this point because the slide heads don't need to be hit accurately. There are some cases with extremely short sliders though, which can make the sliders like extremely hard to play because of how they're calculated. So, for example, if you do have a very short slider, if you want to place an example down.
like say, let's go even like this or something.
So,
Something like this.
usually at OD8, the hit window for hitting this slider head is 120 milliseconds before and after the point the slider head is at. There's an issue with short sliders though. So this slider ends probably about 20 milliseconds after the slider head, or more like 30.
So, yeah, sort of.
So what this means is to hit this slider and to not brake on it, you have to hit the slider head either 120 milliseconds before or 30 milliseconds after the slider head. So it's cut down the timing window for hitting late. Because of course, if you do hit late, the slider end will have already been played and it results in a miss. Now, there is definitely a use case for these kinds of sliders, on like very maybe intense or specific sounds. And they do have a kind of interesting gameplay where you are forced to hit them early. But this slider is quite a bit more difficult than a circle just because the timing window is so much shorter. So you have to be very careful when using these kinds of things.
Yeah, especially in say the future where in laser the new scoring system is probably going to be forced, unless they find some kind of workaround around this. Or if you're tourney mapping. In tournaments they usually force score v2, and in those cases sliders like these are really annoying, unless it's like maybe a gimmicky pick or something, and it's like a bit higher rank. You can probably expect people to kind of play this and just hit early. But otherwise, like say streams of sliders like these, uh, those are really, really annoying to play with Scorpy 2. Like, because you have to be basically twice as accurate as if this was just circles, which is a lot more challenging. It's like almost as if you quickly turn on OD11 for just this one single stream, and it
There is
must
also
be early.
yeah, so you kind of have to hit them early to hit them, and there's also kind of an issue as well where some players, when playing these kinds of sliders, do kind of have some kind of muscle memory or habit of hitting them early to avoid the misses. So that kind of ruins the playability with Score V2 as well.
Yeah. So that was about it for like all the accuracy related slider head accuracy related stuff. Now let's move on to like the probably the most important topic, at least in my opinion, when it comes to sliders, which is slider body and leniency. So as we sort of earlier explained when talking about the mechanics of a slider, you don't have to perfectly follow a slider. You can stay within the ball area, within the slider follow circle area around the ball, and there are all these other things about how you can potentially just release the key, technically speaking. We're just going to focus on some specific examples, and then we get a bit more broad. So first one, there's a few sliders that pretty much every player should know that he can abuse slider leniency on. They're just really common examples. For example, slider like this. I think almost anyone who's played this game for like more than 3 weeks would probably know that you don't have to follow the reverse of the slider. You can just click the button down and it will play perfectly. Yeah. So that's only possible because of slider body leniency. Kind of same thing for longer reverses. Like this, for example. I can move around however I want, kind of, because I just have to stay within the ball area whenever there's a reverse happening. Another common example, I guess, might be sliders like these, where a lot of you might have seen some of these. I'm not quite sure, but you can probably imagine that if a slider looks like this, no matter what the SV is, it's basically going to play around half as fast, or just in general slower, because the body is squished so much together, so you can abuse that in this kind of way. Usually nowadays maps have like sliders like these that are a bit longer with the tumor generator tool. And in fact, the tumor generator tool, if you've heard about that in mapping tools, accounts for this kind of leniency by, if you take a slider like this and then you put the tumor generator on it, it will increase the SV so that it basically plays at the same speed in terms of how you have to move through it. I don't quite know how the exact calculation works. But those are like probably the most simple examples of how slider body leniency kind of affects gameplay through sliders. And really kind of shows how to really understand how sliders play, you at least have to some degree understand this concept of how the player doesn't have to perfectly follow the slider ball. They can kind of just like move sort of through the slider. They don't have to perfectly follow it. Like I could play this in by moving in a straight line, kind of like this.
Yeah, so
You have any thoughts?
players never really follow the exact shape of sliders, just pretty much the easiest, like least the path of least resistance, as long as as long as the cursor's within the slider ball, and the slider follows circle. One thing that's kind of important to know is quite a few skins that people play with don't include slider balls. Slider follow circles is probably the most important one. It would probably be quite useful to map with a skin that does have the slider follow circle. If you're not very, it can be pretty hard to judge movement through sliders. Having the slider follow circle to kind of help you understand where the cursor has to be to actually hit it can be very helpful when judging if certain kinds of sliders are playable. So yeah,
Yeah,
this skin, for example, doesn't have a slider follow circle. It just has a slider follow ball. So it's good for playing, but it can make it more difficult for in terms of mapping as well.
yeah. Or at the very least to like judge the kind of movement of sliders without the slider follow circle would probably need a little bit more just experience with the editor. Like I feel like personally I could maybe even map with this kind of skin. I don't actively like think about the slider follow circle when I think about movement. Or at least not that much. So it's possible to map without it, but it's definitely recommended to map with a slider follow circle. Also different skins will have like slider follow circles that have different sizes, so you should be careful to use a skin that maybe uses a slider follow circle that's approximately the size of the default skin. Maybe one that's maybe just using the default skin. I kind of use one that's sort of like an edit of the default skin. So it's just the slider follow circle is a little bit more transparent, which I find more useful when doing some other stuff with it, but whatever. Now afterward we can get into a few more specific examples that you might also know. Let's get a map that's like 170 BPM or something. Because obviously the BPM will affect like the kind of hit window of stuff, etc. Let's delete all of this. Whatever that was. So another interesting case. Actually, let's also change the circle size. So a lot of you probably knew the examples from earlier, but another one that maybe some of you know, but maybe not all of you, are 1-4 sliders. They are kind of a common thing where slider leniency is really important to know how it affects them. And then in the case of them, it's both the body and the end leniency that does like a lot of the work. So I have like written down a little hypothetical example. At around 180 BPM, 1-4 sliders or gaps are about 83 milliseconds long. If you take away the 36 milliseconds for the slider end leniency, so the slider will end 36 milliseconds earlier, as we talked about last time or earlier. Effectively, the slider will basically be only 47 milliseconds long, actually, if we account for that. So to really play these kind of sliders, you only have to hold down your key for a 20th of a second, and after that you could like move your cursor across the other side of the screen 1 millisecond later, and you would still hit the 1/4 slider. Maybe try and sort of show just how lean it is. Like I will try to literally press my key down as if I'm playing a circle, and just move really quickly away. Wow, epic lag.
You may be moving a little bit
kinda
too
works.
quickly.
It kind of works. I have to maybe hold down a little bit more. Yeah, I might move a little bit too quickly. So you can definitely see just how lenient they kind of are. It's not literally as if they are circles, but you can almost treat 1/4 sliders as just circles. And that's in fact what a lot of kind of mappers do. They will sort of just like treat the heads of these sliders as like circles where there's an additional hit sound on the slider end. And then the actual like even the actual orientation of where the sliders are going is basically irrelevant. Like whether they point into each other or away from each other doesn't quite matter in terms of what the movement of them is. It's all about where the slider heads are. In fact, a mistake some people might seem to often make is they might make patterns like this, where you might learn from somewhere that it's good when sliders point into each other. That's like basic movement. That's very comfortable movement or something. With 1/4 sliders though, it's a bit different because in this case, this will effectively play more like a wide angle jump. So something like this. Give me a sec. Yeah, so we'll be basically like this instead, which I assume a lot of people don't want. I mean, there's nothing really wrong with this inherently, but it's a problem if you think that your jumps are like super basic movement, but when in reality they are like a wide angle or something.
Something just to clarify is that this really only applies to higher BPMs. So this
Yeah.
song is 170. Maybe even 170 might be slightly low. I mean, this kind of stuff does still apply to 170 BPM. The higher
Yeah.
the BPM is, the more relevant this point is. Something I mentioned as well at lower BPMs, like maybe 150 or lower, this point doesn't apply too much because you do need to hold the slider down longer. So for example, in alt maps, this kind of thing doesn't apply because you do have to kind of follow sliders. It's very BPM dependent.
Yeah, if we go to some random alt map with some sliders in it. I think this might be nah, that's not a good example. Fuck. Maybe this one. Kind of. So in this case, kind of as Jordan mentioned, because the BPM is so low, these feel a lot less like they are just circles. You have to hold a little bit more down. This is obviously kind of changes the entire gameplay of alt maps a lot. In some sense, you could maybe still kind of play them as if they're just circles, sort of, but it's not more difficult. And they will also oftentimes in these kind of maps just be longer, like maybe even longer than this. And the kind of visual length of them will probably also affect how you like perceive them while playing. Like if they are shorter, then it will obviously also be easier to move further away from them quickly. It will be easier to abuse the slider body leniency of them. But then in return, or the other way around, at like say 220 BPM, sliders, 1/4 sliders will play even closer to circles. And then if we get to like 240 or something, then we will get kind of in this range again where they are almost like those super short sliders where you have to kind of click them early. So there's definitely a lot of like BPM dependent stuff that plays into how sliders sort of play and taking leniency into account. Like if they are in this like 1/4 slider range of 180 BPM to 230 or something, they will kind of play like circles. If it's below, or maybe even if it's a 1/2 a half beat slider, then you will have to click down a lot more, like, but can then release a little bit earlier, etc. So another common example, I think it's probably not quite in here. Oh, actually, it kind of is. Let me find this. Yeah, it's probably not in this. This is not a good example of that. Let me go to something that's 170 or something again. Oh yeah, this is a good example. So something that you might see in a lot of maps is that when there's a half beat slider with some 1/4 right afterwards, maybe even arranged exactly like this, the 1/4 tends to be spaced out more out of the slider, while afterwards, if it's if it's in circles, it's kind of like overlapping. This is like a sort of very basic way in which slider end leniency can kind of be used. For example, if I just made this overlap like this, which would be kind of like a thing you might assume makes a lot of sense. It's a bit that technically speaking does work out. There's nothing really wrong with it. Might even just play completely fine. But because you have this extra leniency right at the end, you can sort of just force a little bit more smooth movement out of the slider by moving the 1/4 a little bit further away. This kind of also applies to other rhythms besides 1/4. So something you will oftentimes see especially in alternator style maps, like the one from earlier or something. Let me find one. Val. Val doesn't have any 150 maps apparently. Yeah, let's go with this one again, I guess. What you will oftentimes see is that out of sliders in these kind of maps, there's generally higher spacing. So it's always higher spacing out of the sliders. Like these kind of patterns where the 1/4 is like really spaced out of the slider, and then afterwards it's almost overlapping or just about spaced out. That's a very common thing you will see in alternator style maps, and also in hard difficulties. Like I have one here where I think I kinda do that, maybe. And there's probably a lot of overlapping kind of stuff, or stuff like stuff like this, sort of. Nah, not really. But I think you might get the point. That like because of the end leniency, because you can move away from the slider these 33 milliseconds earlier, you have this like short little time window where the player can just move away from the slider more quickly.
Yeah, because of that, a lot of players, I mean, when playing those larger spacings out of sliders, because the slider end's calculated 40 milliseconds earlier than the actual slider end, and there's such a huge slider follow circle as well. Um,
True.
like here, both kind of combine to mean that to kind of keep the spacing consistent in terms of like the cursor movement, you do have to space higher out of sliders. So yeah, this is the kind of thing which is introduced in hard diffs, but pretty much used on all patterns, like above a hard, so insane and extra.
Yeah. Um, it's not something all mappers do universally. There are a lot of hard diffs, for example, which are completely distance snapped, or just in general, I think a lot of maps that are around 170 BPM, people will sort of have the same spacing out of sliders as they will between circles, and but then when people map alternator style, they do it differently. It seems to be, I think, the case that as in the old BPM range, like either below 160 or above 230, because movement kind of is more fast paced or like more stringent, there you will notice a lot more if spacing out of sliders is like too small, so to speak. Like if I put this pattern like here and we assumed it was a lot faster, you might almost feel that there after this slider there's like this little moment where you can kind of slow down a bit or almost stop, and then you have to hit the next object or the next two objects. But when spacing out a little bit more, when sort of overextending or something, you're forcing a lot more consistent movement through everything, especially within the alternative style, sort of. It's probably kind of necessary in that style to do that. Like if you space everything the same, if you space all the 1/4 gaps the same, it will feel kind of unnatural or weird to most people, I believe.
Yeah.
While at 170 or 220, you can kind of get away with not doing it, but it might sort of feel better. Even in those maps, you kind of have a little bit more spacing out of sliders because they have this extra leniency. Do you want to say something?
Yeah. Well, the next question you may ask is how do you know how much to space out of sliders? Can you answer that for me?
So that's definitely a really difficult one. In the doc I've written down that about 1.5 times the spacing between circles is generally speaking a decent idea, especially say for a hard difficulty or an alternator style map. Maybe even in an alternator style map that's 150, it's almost twice as much. But it's kind of difficult to give an exact number. It's probably kind of impossible. Like you just actually it's probably not impossible, but you need to just have a lot of experience either, or almost make like a table of with what slider velocity and BPM what kind of numbers come out or something. Uh which is probably really tedious and nobody has ever tried to do that. Neither have I.
And it is really going to depend on the style of map and circle size and such as well. I mean,
Yeah.
generally it should be between like 1.5 and 2 times as spaced. One thing, if you're not really don't have an intuition for it, if you're able to playtest a map, just playtest it and see what works.
Yeah, playtesting is really important probably for this. It's also good that you mentioned kind of circle size. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think if circle size is bigger, um, since the slider follow circle is always going to be 2.4 times the size of the circles.
Yeah,
Effectively, at
so
lower CS, sliders are even more lenient.
yeah, this is true.
Yeah. So this is also why oftentimes with lower CS like CS3 or 2, people tell you to or have more difficult kind of movement or more awkward movement because the leniency and probably a lot of other factors like just the circles being bigger, etc. Um, just like make everything a lot easier to play. Well, the other way around, if you make something that's CS7, maybe you should use a little bit less spacing out of sliders, but probably still more than between circles overall. It's just but yeah, overall it's just a really difficult topic. But of how much to exactly space out. But I think it's really it can be something that makes your map go from like being relatively decent to like really, really nice. Like especially a lot of mappers that I think have really good movement kind of do that kind of stuff. But yeah, moving on. So another kind of like topic that's sort of relevant when it comes to slider body leniency is about how like how do I put this? So far we've looked at like a lot of relatively simple examples of where people just or just really common examples like the 1-4 sliders, the a little bit higher 1-4 spacing out of sliders, etc. But you can kind of think about how slider leniency affects almost any kind of pattern overall and how they might not play as they look. So let me open up quickly a map with someone. Okay, I have the correct version. Oh, I don't. Why did it show that it's the ranked one? That's cheating. Okay. So this map is kind of interesting because it definitely looks like it has a lot of really, really difficult kind of movement. Especially patterns like say these. You might be thinking that you have to like move upwards here and then you have to move downwards here. That's a huge amount of spacing compared to here where the spacing is seemingly almost half as high or something, etc. And then here it's low again. It's seems kind of really, really strange, maybe. But if we now think about how can we actually how does slider body leniency actually affect the movement of these sliders? It might be a little bit different. For example, in this case, you might be thinking that seems like a really huge jump. Like it's probably half the screen. Yeah, about. Like if we assume that the player moves until the slider end. But if we take away the slider end leniency, for example, well, it's about here the slider would end. And also here on like this yellow tick in the timeline. And then there's the slider follow circle, of course.
So of course
So you
this
have to
means
only move up to this point, roughly speaking.
most players aren't gonna cheese it to
Exactly.
the max, but
Yeah.
this means a player could just go to the left side of this follow circle right here, and then move to the 2 circle whilst leaving the slider early, which gives them an extra eighth of a beat to hit the second circle, and means they don't need to fully follow this slider as well.
Yeah. And that will, if we now think about it in that way, it will kind of reduce this the actual spacing of this, or at least if a player is skilled enough to abuse the slider leniency of the slider well, then the actual jump isn't as huge as it might seem. Like maybe if you're not as skilled, you kind of have to follow the slider a bit more. Yes, probably not worth doing it in playtesting. I kind of made some pictures about how the movement could potentially look like, although it's always difficult to like describe these kind of things with just like arrows on the screen or something. I don't know if you can maybe put those in the video later or just
Yeah,
if I can just post them somewhere.
show picture here.
Wait, how?
No, it's fine. Continue. I was clapping,
Oh,
so I've
okay.
got a timestamp.
Okay, that's good. Um, Maybe another even more obvious example would be again this kind of pattern of sliders. So the odd one out is these two here, where because this is like about 140 BPM. Let's see, what's 250? 520 minus 36.
484, 486.
Yeah. Okay, so the slider will end about roughly halfway through it. And obviously there's a little slider ball, slider follow circle. Again, nobody is going to really accurately know where exactly the position is. But what that kind of means in gameplay is that I don't really, when playing this, I don't really have to follow this slider almost at all. I can kind of just like sort of do this. Yeah, I hope that was kind of visible. And while earlier you might have thought that the spacing between this slider end and the slider head here is extremely huge, again, close to half this screen space, while between these three sliders it's like half as much. If we now take into account that the player doesn't really have to follow the slider, the spacing becomes a lot more consistent throughout the entire pattern. It's just that if someone is, say, doesn't know that or doesn't have a good sense of how to abuse sliders, this part will be a lot more difficult to play. And there's a ton of other patterns in this kind of map that sort of function in this way, where to really understand how this map actually plays, you kind of have to think about how can these sliders be abused? Like, does the player really have to move down when playing this one? Probably not. They will kind of click the head and then move to the next one. See if I can do that. Oh, I can't click. Cool. Uh, the fuck? I'm too bad.
I think you're getting note locked by, yeah.
Okay. So yeah, that was kind of possible. Maybe I can even remove these and then test. Yeah, that one almost plays like just like a circle as well. Probably have to hold down a little bit longer. Yeah. So this is kind of this. I think this map overall is like really decent example of how the map, if you don't understand how slider leniency works, seems kind of like the movement is really inconsistent and unstructured and doesn't really make sense at first sight. But once you understand sort of maybe how people can abuse sliders, and maybe if you play test a few of the patterns, seems to make a lot more sense. Now, obviously, we can also have examples of the opposite, where maybe someone makes a kind of really complex slider shape that say looks like this, I don't know. And they somehow expect the player, or I don't know, let's say this is really fast as well. What's a good number, Jordan? 5 or 6?
6.1.
Okay, let's go. So, really epic slider, right? So, a bad understanding of slider leniency might lead you to believe that this requires a lot of movement to play or something like that. Might even do us in some ways, but let's see how I would actually play that, or if I can even play it. I mean, so my instinct is kind of to just move upwards and then move to the right side. It could be that because this is like really thick, I can't quite do it. But irrelevant of whatever the slider shape is, the kind of basic idea I want to sort of get across is that you might think that a certain shape plays a certain way and that it's really intense to play when it's actually not. Or something else you might see in a few tech maps. Maybe I'll put up an actual example of a map. Although it's kind of mean if I do it. You want to say something so far? Want to look something up?
No, not necessarily. There's also something kind of careful that you need to be when it comes to sliders is you can kind of understand how players may choose certain shapes. You should be mindful of how they will cheese them to at least make them somewhat playable. Because if you create a certain kind of shape which implies some kind of movement, but for example, it's quite a fast slider, so the slider end's actually calculated in some strange place. That's something to be very mindful of because that's something that can be seen a lot in like more modern high SV tech maps and like new gen style maps.
Yeah. Let me actually get first another example that I also had on my sheet of something that was not felt. It was a really old map of mine, and there's a specific pattern in it that I still remember that I thought played a certain way, but it really didn't. So I thought that this pattern here is really intense to play. That like when you move through the slider, you play it sort of like this, which is if the player would actually move like that, or if most players would actually move like that, that would be really cute. But it probably plays more like this. Which is a lot less intense to play than what I intended. And we kind of mentioned in like a very old lecture how it would be good if the intensity of the gameplay was sort of correlated to our interpretation of how intense the song is. Now, if we don't understand how our patterns can be cheesed, they might be, to some players, they might be a lot less intense than we have actually intended. In this case, I feel like the song is relatively intense here, or more intense than what this actually is in gameplay. But because I didn't understand how it plays, it ends up not representing the song in the way that I wanted or that I should have.
Just because of that slider end leniency, it's just pretty much took away most of the emphasis from the free slider.
Yeah, kinda. It's the two slider as well. It's kind of just like click the head and chill a little bit, or you can kind of click it. There's still some movement through it, but it's not as much as I wanted. Like this big, huge arch movement. Whatever.
So if
Yeah.
you were to fix this pattern, how would you fix it?
There are always multiple kind of ways of doing this stuff. One thing is that it's not necessarily bad if the player does cheese my slider, but it depends on how spaced the movement or how much they are still moving around. In this case, if I wanted to move to force a bit more movement, I could maybe move this one further away, or just move the heads further away from each other. Another thing, if I really wanted the player to move through the body of the slider, I could move this one up here, so it's more of a kind of implied movement. Now, the slider doesn't directly have to point into this one. Whether it points into this one or not doesn't really make it more or less comfortable. If we take slider leniency into account, some people might say that you have to have sliders that really point into each other in this way to have comfortable movement, but kind of don't. But yeah, it could also move it over here or something. I don't know if there's maybe another good example in this map. Or let me just make another common pattern where people might make a mistake. Like, let's say I have a pattern that's like, well, that's too low SV. Let me just delete something quickly. Oh, oops. Let's say I have a pattern like this, and my intention was that it plays like this. More. That I move like a lot through it, but instead the player can kind of just do this. So one easy way to fix this is to move it further away, as mentioned earlier. Now, it might look really weird now because the slider end again is so far away from the head, but it doesn't quite matter. Because now, even though the player will still abuse this one, like they will only move maybe a third or halfway through the body, the gameplay will sort of still retain nice movement. Assuming that this is about the speed that I want. If I wanted the player to move even more, obviously I would move it further away. And the essential thing is sort of the distance between the slider heads, or like the last point of where I expect the player to be. So maybe the middle of the slider would have to be a thing that's most important. Of course, the other thing I could do is just, as mentioned earlier, just have them go into each other. That's probably in most cases the most basic thing to do. Yeah, whether you use one or the other, you can kind of differentiate or represent things in the song with using one movement versus the other. Maybe you could have some kind of concept where you think about whether the slider end is harder to hit or something in this way. You can kind of think about that for yourself, I feel like. Yeah. So now we can kind of talk about the topic that I want to bring up earlier. Wait, this is kind of an interesting map. This kind of looks like an Avalon style tech map, but it was like made in 2018 or something, or maybe even 17. And this mapper only ranked this one map, and then I don't know what they did. They didn't rank anything else. So excuse me for maybe talking about it in a bad light or something, but that's like one specific thing that's maybe worth thinking about when making these kinds of maps, which is you will always have like these big kind of sliders in maps like these. You might notice something. There are sort of some sounds that are repeat a few times, like this. And here, etc. Now, you might have noticed that all of these shapes are very different from each other. I think maybe DSV is the same. So one consequence of using completely different shapes each time is that how sort of how intense the movement is going to vary a lot. Like in this case, I would say there's relatively much movement, especially because the slider is like so big, it goes across half the screen. I think that that fits relatively well. But then we have like say this one where this slider arguably doesn't really require much movement at all. And this next slider also not really in comparison to this one. No, I guess this one is also just longer in terms of rhythm. But really this one is, I think, the one that makes the difference for me. It's like the mapper, I think, could have made the map a lot better if this kind of sound that repeats a few times had like shapes that at least have had a similar amount of movement intensity through them. Like if I play this one, I can cheese it really easily. I almost have to not move at all. While on the other one, it's a lot more difficult to cheese it. At least that's how I feel. What are your thoughts on
Well,
this?
yeah. So even though the SVs are the same, like the slider shape affects how sliders are played so much. Might be the same slider speed, but sliders can have gradually like a different actual movement and like cursor speed through them, just purely because of the shape. Now you can kind of compensate for this if you wanted to by increasing and decreasing slider velocity to kind of match
Yeah.
the kind of movement. Probably the most common way of doing it is just by using shapes which are kind of small alterations of each other. And not like vastly different in terms of the composition, where the movement gets affected a lot.
Yeah. And also important to keep in mind, at least with say a slider shape like this one, because it's so compact, or because the curve is like really sharp, you're gonna require a lot more SV to really force the player to move through this one. Like, even if I increase the SV from 1.5 to 2, and then make the shape bigger or something. It's still kind of going to play like this, where I just move a little bit down and then move to the next object. Now the mapper could just go, maybe could have gone just full gamer mode and just have done this or something, where you now have to really, really move down on the screen to move to the next one. But at the same time, that also there's probably a few people, a few BNs who maybe will then look at the discrepancies in the SV and be really wondering what are you doing here? Why is this necessary? And then you would have at least have to explain yourself. Where in the case of just using shapes that are more consistent with each other, you kind of don't have that issue. So there's kind of like ups and downs to both methods. I think kind of with the case where you either just move the heads further away from each other or make the slider movement consistently implied. Both are valid ways of sort of dealing with this kind of issue. It's just important that you think about how does the shape of my slider or the composition and distance between the slider heads affect the movement? How does it make the movement maybe less intense or more intense in the actual gameplay versus just how it looks to me on screen? I mean, we even had the example earlier of this like shape where it's just really obvious that it's going to play slower because it has these bunch of anchors. I mean, even later in the map, the mapper kind of does stuff like that, where there's these kind of sliders. There's another, yeah, like this one. In fact, I'm kind of wondering whether the mapper really intended this one to be more intense or not, like whether he thought the the player to move around through it instead of just doing this.
Is this
I'm
map
not
tick
sure.
rate 0.5? Yeah.
Yes.
It's-
I didn't even remember that. Also, this was made before you could use 10x SVs, so it's base level velocity 3.2. This is a really interesting map, whether you like it or not. Okay. So there's one kind of last sort of topic to talk about when it comes to, or is it the last topic? Sort of when it comes to just how to think about the scalar setter body leniency stuff. So Jordan sort of earlier kind of mentioned that no player is going to really perfectly abuse slider leniency, and that's kind of obviously true. Now one kind of question is like, well, how much do they actually abuse leniency? And I think that's a really complicated question. Like you could argue that even in this map, maybe some player would just try to perfectly follow all the sliders, and then the issues that I pointed out wouldn't be issues at all, so to speak. I think from my point of view, kind of best argument in favor of optimizing sliders is sort of that most people will kind of abuse leniency first of all, and then if you have a map where the movement that's sort of forced through your sliders is like where it really forces the player to abuse this leniency to play it how you want. The players who usually would just play the map how it looks would then be forced to play it by abusing the sliders because it would get more difficult for them. While the people who are really good at abusing slider leniency, for them it plays exactly how you want it.
This is also
That's it.
very dependent on the skill of the player playing the map as well.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't do anything like this in a hard difficulty where this kind of slider body and slider end lenience is only just being introduced in a spread. For an insane, you could probably play it a bit more loose. and then kind of from there extra and up. If you are mapping something like, for example, an 8-star, you can pretty much expect all players to cheese the patterns. So it does depend on like the target audience for the map as well.
Yeah, there were also, when we talked about the mechanics of the slider specifically, there were these examples of where you didn't really have to follow the slider body at all, or could release the key, or only had to follow exactly where the slider ticks are. I think that kind of abuse is something that almost nobody will really do in a map unless it's like the design of the map like really forces you to do that. Like a good example was the kind of Hollow Wings map, the nutshell one, where it sort of encourages you to abuse sliders even more than what we talked about so far with like the slider ball, etc. Just because it's just so hard to follow this. Like if you try to really stay within the slider ball to play this, you would have some real issues, and that's why some players who are good enough or kind of understand how the game works, like say Jordan, they when they get maybe overwhelmed with a slider like this that's going to be super fast or just really huge, you might just opt to just follow the slider ticks in those cases. Uh, so that's also kind of a thing to keep in mind. Not just the overall player skill, but also like there are certain kinds of map design that will trigger the player to go from only unconsciously abusing sliders to really, really, really abusing the slider mechanics.
Yeah.
But in most cases, you can kind of assume that the player is going to um, only really abuse the slider leniency that you get from the slider follow circle, and maybe on 1-4 sliders or just sliders generally, the like stuff that way you can lift off earlier because of the slider and leniency.
Yeah, but unless a map's using some really long rhythm sliders or really high SV, it's not really something that you need to be too concerned with slider tick choosing.
Yeah. Another kind of thing to maybe mention or talk about is like so when thinking about how about slider leniency, I think it's important to think about how it affects the intensity of gameplay, as mentioned earlier. There are some cases where it seems like people kind of appeal to slider leniency only really to sort of justify and say my pattern is playable. I think, and then they don't really talk about how exactly that gameplay then somehow relates to the intensity of the song or something. There might be some tech mappers who kind of use that excuse, although I don't want to blame anybody. I don't really know whether people actually do that. There might be someone who, hypothetically speaking, will say, well, because of slider leniency, people can play all my sliders, so I can basically do whatever slider shape I kind of want, because they can just abuse the slider leniency, right? Well, that doesn't really consider how the slider leniency really affects, again, the actual intensity.
Yeah, one good sort of litmus test as to how legitimate those reasons can be is like how intuitive the cheese is. If it's for example in like Crisis Fallen, it's not really intuitive to cheese hitting the slider ends in that map. So I wouldn't really see that as a real justification. Only like the most um, like players dedicated to learning specific cheese for every single slider can play this. I'll put some
Yeah,
screenshots up as to how this actually plays.
yeah, this is an interesting example. On a doc, I even linked like a little video of how this one can be played. This one is a really interesting example of slider leniency, and also of this kind of example of like how probably when this pattern was made, I don't want to. I'm only speculating on what Chris's intention might have been, but my kind of assumption is that he made the pattern first, and then afterwards he sort of thought about how the slider leniency justifies it in some way. Because say this triangle in the like little video that's shown, the movement the player is like doing is they click on the head and then they move in this direction, like straight to the right, which is a really tiny movement. It's like not very intense at all. And then the movement between from this slider is just like you move from the head to the like upper right corner of the triangle, and then you move to the top half here. And where's the slider end? It's like what's 212 minus 36?
The slider end is like halfway between. It's like halfway through the linear section.
Well, I think the player in the screenshot sort of like goes to here,
It's earlier than that.
like around here.
It's around there, yeah.
Let me see if I can do it, so, or like at least show kind of how it might be done on the screen. No, I can't. Yeah, maybe you can even insert the video or something into ours.
Yeah.
It is quite strange how this pattern plays. And to be honest, if you like really analyze just how the player is abusing that one, and then think about does that really represent the intensity of what's going on here in the song? Maybe. But then when you also look back at an earlier pattern, this one, ironically enough, forces probably more movement through it than the next one that's higher SV and goes across the entire screen.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it does.
Yeah.
So my point is really no player, unless a player's literally in the editor analyzing a map, no player can really know on-site read where the last 36 milliseconds of a slider is.
Yeah.
So the kind of cheese you really need to be concerned about is like a cheese which a player might actually be able to sight read. Um, cheese which is kind of intuitive to a player, not like this is kind of like the opposite.
Yeah. And it seems like, again, I'm just like interpreting what could be the intentions, but it seems like this pattern was just made and then it was said. The slider leniency makes it possible to play, so it's okay. But I feel like being possible to play is like a really low bar.
Yeah.
Yeah. The whole topic about like how much exactly players cheese again is kind of difficult to exactly know how much. There are some funny examples I've encountered. It's like a map of mine. What's that? This one. It's just like one pattern somewhere through here, where I asked like someone to play test this map, who usually doesn't think that's that players really abuse slider, or didn't used to think that people abuse slider leniency at all. So I thought this kind of pattern would sort of play as it looks, that you have to like follow this reverse at least a little bit and then do this huge jump to the circle. Apparently what that guy was doing, just subconsciously without even thinking about it, he moved from 1 to 2, and then from 2 he kind of like stayed a little bit on the reverse and then just moved straight to 3. So he kind of moved through the pattern in a line without really following the reverse at all. That was really surprising to me. Again, especially because he was the kind of person who was like scoffing at the idea that people would abuse slider leniency in such a way like this. Then he just does it unintentionally just because he's like a relatively good player. So it can be sometimes surprising how much or people abuse slider leniency, I feel like, without even knowing. Although it is, I think, in most cases going to just be the kind of leniency where you just sort of stay within the follow circle and maybe move away from sliders earlier. It's not going to be the insane stuff like in Fallen or in Not Shell.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's about where I sort of draw the line, but you might be thinking differently about it. If someone is designing a map completely just around how it sort of looks on screen, without the leniency, just assuming that the player will accurately follow the map, there isn't like some kind of perfect argument against that. But I personally don't think that's a good way to think about it. Okay. Anyway, so now that we talked a whole lot about slider leniency, maybe we can talk a little bit sort of about how people conventionally talk about movement with sliders. Like say from the Pishyfat or Mo videos, that kind of like theory. So as a little quote from a Pishyfat video, which is, if circles are like one element, sliders are like three. That also means that compared to circles, there are 3 times as many ways to mess up movement with a slider. So kind of what he's referring to is that, well, into a circle, the only kind of movement you really have is the movement into it, sort of. There isn't quite like really a movement out of it per se. I think you can only really talk about, my opinion, about the movement into a circle. While with a slider, there's 3, maybe even 4 kind of parts to the movement. There's the movement into the slider, or into any slider from the previous object. So let's take this slider. You have to somehow move into it just like a circle to the slider head. And there's the movement within the slider body. That's going to be only really relevant if it's a more complex shape, maybe with one slider tick. Oh, I skipped over movement into the slider body. So like in this case, kind of like the angle at which you go into the slider body is like relatively sharp, as opposed to like this, where it's in line with the movement from this one. There's the movement out of the slider, and sort of, so like from this one to the next one, and there's the overall rotation, if there is any at all. So to talk about that, let's go kind of one by one. So first one is just angle into a slider. Let me just remove some objects. I can just put on a single slider or something. Wow, amazing slider. Okay, cool. So let me see. Can have kind of like 2 basic kinds of entries into the slider. One, as shown earlier, is this kind of sharp motion into it. So like when you move from this object into this one, it's going into the opposite direction, kind of like when snapping between objects, sort of. And there's this one where you go into the same direction as the slider.
So to say when the entry into the slider body is harsh, the move it depends on the movement entering the slider. So if this slider on screen is control G'd, the movement between 1 and 2 is going to the left, and then the movement between the slider head and the slider tail is in the complete opposite direction. So it needs like a complete direction change to follow the slider body. Now,
Yeah,
usually that kind of movement is what's seen as intense because it requires more changes in momentum, so to say, more changes in movement to play.
yeah. I personally sometimes feel like it's a bit difficult to say which one is really the more uncomfortable one, personally. I almost feel like I usually kind of like this kind of movement, whether it's really awkward or not. But kind of something that I think is important is that you should have kind of like a mix between both of these kind of entries. One thing that this kind of entry is generally speaking good for is sort of it puts a little bit more emphasis on holding the slider down. So if there's like a held sound in the song, then it might be good to use this kind of movement into the slider body instead of this one. And obviously that only works if let me put it another way. If every entry into a slider body is like this sharp angle into it, then it won't really sort of stand out. You can't really represent any difference in the song with it. But if you sort of use both types, you can kind of use that to represent some differences in the song potentially. Although I feel like they oftentimes kinda similar. Also, something I kind of skipped over is that we're not going to really talk about the movement into the slider head, because basically that's the same as with circles, kind of. Like, as we talked about this in the circle where the lecture about jumps / movement with circles, etc. There's differences between whether it's a wide angle or it's a sharp angle into this one, etc. Blah 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 blah. If you care about that, then I guess you should
Like
watch that lecture.
the only difference between treating the only difference between like a 1-2 circle jump or this slide or the second object being a slider, the only difference really is the slider head leniency, which can slightly affect gameplay depending on how it's used, but effectively it plays the same.
Yeah, I think it sometimes almost feels like it makes the aim aspect of the slider feel a little bit more lenient as well. Do you get that feeling?
Yeah, especially on larger spacing.
Yeah, kinda. Like you don't have to think as much about when to click, unless you're playing Scovy too, I guess.
Well, with larger spacing, especially if it's, for example, like a quick snapping, like a cross screen, like quick snap kind of motion, it is kind of in my muscle memory to know that I can click sliders late, so I don't need to aim as fast. So it
Mhm.
only really applies to like very fast aim.
Yeah. Okay, the next type would be the movement within the slider body. For that one, we probably need a map with longer sliders. I can't spell my own name. Let's go for this one. So this map has some bit long sliders. So because there's like this one slider tick here, there's going to be at least one change kind of in motion, say in this slider, where we go from this one in here. At some point we're going to change direction. Like say from here, it's kind of like you go to the left and then you go down. I guess technically speaking, the sharper this sort of angle were, the more difficult it would be to follow the slider. And at the same time, there's also some kind of like added difficulty depending on how easy it is to like abuse the corner. Like if it's a really sharp corner, then it's also going to be a bit easier to abuse it with the slider body leniency. What do you feel like is like really hard movement within a slider, or versus a bit easier? You have any thoughts on that?
Um, well, if we're talking about, let's not take readability into question. I mean, like
Yeah.
the hardest movement within sliders is genuinely like awkwardly placed slider ticks because they just change the way sliders are played so much. If you go through a map, basically cheesing a lot of sliders, and then you get these longer sliders which need to be more accurately followed, it's a lot harder to adjust.
Yeah. That was funny.
Something like this slider on screen as well might be an example because you can kind of split a slider which has a tick in it, you can kind of split it up into two sections. The shape of this first section is quite slow, so it doesn't require much movement. Whilst the speed change needed from the slider tick to the slider end You kind of have to speed up to hit the slider end.
Yeah, that adds some extra. It makes it both probably harder to read because you have to. There's this portion when John said slower, he meant that it's easier to abuse slider leniency on this like little bump. And then obviously this portion is faster because it doesn't have that bump. So it is both probably harder to read because you have to like kind of have a good sense for how to abuse the slider, but then also at the same time it probably requires a little bit more cursor control as well. Like you have to actually change the speed of your cursor within the slider, which is probably rather uncommon, I imagine.
Yes, I would say so, because a lot of the times sliders which kind of have that effect of changing speed don't have ticks in them, so they're like a lot more lenient in terms of like how accurate you need to be with the cursor.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that sort of covers a lot about movement within a slider. Movement within a slider, to some degree, does kind of come down to how you just have to analyze it in terms of, again, the slider body leniency. That's sort of what it comes down to a lot of the times. Maybe if it's a really, really huge slider, like those notch shell sliders, you kind of have to think maybe about the placement of your ticks. Like if you still want the player to move around a lot, placing the ticks so they are strategically further away from each other would be a good idea.
One thing to
Uh,
know, which might be kind of some people will already be aware of this, of course. Slider ticks, just to like quickly cover them. A slider tick will appear during a slider after one beat or every beat. So
if it's
slide
a tick rate one.
if it's a tick rate one. Um, so if you have your map set to tick rate one, if you ever have a slider that's longer than a beat, you should always be conscious of where the slider tick is within that slider, just to make sure it has the gameplay that you want.
Yeah. Also, that map from earlier with slider tick 0.2 would effectively be every second beat.
It would, yeah. The
Yeah,
most
so
the most based one is slider tick rate 1.5. I've seen that used before. That's a slider tick every 3/4 of a beat.
that's gaming. Okay, so now we can talk about um, exiting sliders. Uh, I find this maybe a little bit more interesting. Yes. So there are essentially three ways of exiting a slider. Um, one would be you have the directly implied path of the slider just points into the next object. Um, you have an object that's within the curvature of the slider, but it's like not directly implied. It's like more over here or something. Um, sort of. Maybe like yeah, it's kind of it. And then you have movement which kind of goes against the curvature of the slider, like this. So I think conventionally speaking, people would consider the first to be the most comfortable, or yeah, I think comfortable is the right word. So that's what most people would consider most comfortable. And then the second one is like conventionally speaking more difficult, and the last one is the most uncomfortable in quotation marks. So arguably speaking, if we analyze this in terms of just the slider leniency, the only thing that really changes between these three kinds of ways of doing it is like the spacing between things. So if I put the slide is more over here, the distance between the head and the next object is arguably speaking maybe a bit shorter than if I put the circle down here with the same DS or something. Then same kind of goes whether it's implied in the direction of the slider curve or whether it's over here. Doesn't really make it more or less uncomfortable. It kind of makes maybe affects your reading of the pattern. So like especially if the map is maybe played by someone who doesn't abuse isn't as good at abusing slider leniency, they might be worse at playing this than this, but that will only be because they are like they just don't understand as much how it actually does play.
Yeah, a lot of players kind of expect just because having the next object within the curvature or in like the expected path of the previous slider, a lot of players expect that. The prime example of this is Alien, because that kind of got a lot of controversy for kind of doing the opposite, where the next objects weren't in the path of the slider. The whole point of that, or at least part of the point of Monstrata's decision to do that, was to make it harder to read. Also to make it chaotic looking as well.
That's interesting. I've never actually heard about that, but that does make sense. But yeah, so an interesting point about this, I guess, is that there might be some kind of disagreement between kind of at least my idea of how like slider movement works, where for me personally it's only really about um the leniency abuse between the head and the next circle, whether it's within the curve of the slider or not, doesn't to me doesn't seem to really affect movement, but only the readability of it. While maybe a lot of other people, conventionally speaking, would talk about it as though this is more comfortable than this.
It is
As
somewhat
in,
relevant, but only in like the more extreme angles. Um, yeah, so if you have like the circle here, it is you do kind of have to deviate a lot from the direction of the slider. Maybe if the slider was maybe more curved, this is a bad example.
yeah, I mean, also
But
maybe if it's more probably the most relevant if the slider is like longer,
yeah,
because then it really does affect like um when I go over here or something, or like the example earlier in the half slash map, um like something like this, that probably does kind of make a difference. Although there's still maybe some argument to be made that the difference is more in how difficult it is to hit the slider end rather than how difficult it is to hit the circle. I guess it makes the overall pattern more difficult because the players like pay attention to not dropping the slider end or not failing the slider. Well, it doesn't necessarily make the actual distance of this one more difficult than this or something. Yeah, but with like one half beat sliders or 1/4 sliders in an alternator style BPM map, it's probably not as relevant, but still important to know about. So
yeah.
that's why I kind of wanted to mention it. Okay. The last kind of topic about slider movement that I have is about the rotation of patterns. Here again, I might deviate a little bit from what people conventionally say about it. So, I mean, the basic idea is that if you have a kind of pattern that, say, goes around in a circle like this, you can maybe ignore the rhythm or the slider length or something, etc. Just assume these are all half-beat sliders at the same BPM, same SV, blah, blah, blah. So, theory is going to be, or if I have any kind of pattern, it can be however spaced or whatever, if it goes in the same rotational direction, so this one goes kind of clockwise. If I have a slider then here that goes in this direction instead, there's going to be emphasis on the slider head of this one, I guess, or just the slider in general because it is changing direction. So it's oftentimes a good idea to only do that if there is a kind of sound in the song that maybe needs some extra emphasis to put it on that one. Now, where it gets maybe a bit more weird is if we do something like, well, well, I guess now the order of objects also change, but who cares? So, Jordan, can you tell me in what direction does the player have? What is the rotational direction of this pattern?
This looks to be clockwise because you do really huge loops between the sliders.
That's a good one, John. Yeah, so one thing that maybe some of you might be thinking is that this pattern might play like this. I don't know. Can't do it quite well, but like, wish I could play this with halftime. So that I'd kind of like do this kind of movement, like I do some arches around here, effectively rotating clockwise. But if we think about like, again, in terms of just the slider leniency of this kind of pattern, it seems to be more a case that I kind of move from the head of this slider to the head of this slider to the head of this slider to the head of this one, and that goes in like a counterclockwise direction. Now I don't actually want to be I don't really want to say that this necessarily is going counterclockwise. I think it's more that it depends on what kind of player is playing your map, and that's uh that's making things a lot more complicated. Because now whether this pattern has the same rotational direction as the previous one or not, will be a little bit out of your control. It will kind of like depend on whether the player is playing it playing those arches or not. You could maybe kind of play around with it where say if you're doing this, you're intentionally doing it, I don't know, to make a pattern more difficult if someone doesn't know how to abuse sliders correctly or something. That it's kind of getting more difficult for them. Or the other way around, I guess, would also be possible maybe. Well, I don't know why you would want to punish someone for understanding slider leniency correctly. Either way, it's once again, it's kind of important to at least think about how does leniency abuse sort of really affect how the pattern is played. So one might be thinking that this one is rotating clockwise. Well, it's probably a little bit more complicated if we take the leniency into account. Do you have any thoughts on that kind of topic?
Yeah, well, I believe kind of similar to the example of exiting sliders, like depending on the rotation, it seems to be more of a readability kind of thing rather than it actually affecting the movement.
Yeah, maybe it also will depend on factors. Oh yeah, like say the gaps between the sliders or like how long they are. Like, I don't know. I think
So
in this case I would actually still kind of perceive it as rotating counterclockwise. But there's maybe if they were a lot faster, I would play them as if they were going clockwise. It is kind of difficult to tell. Like that's again emphasizing the importance of playtesting your map at least maybe a little bit. Yeah. In most cases, it probably won't make a huge difference. Like whether this pattern is going clockwise or counterclockwise, most likely won't make a huge difference to the quality of your map. Like it might add a little bit of emphasis on this slider or something unintentionally, or you might think there is emphasis on the slider when there isn't really or something like that. Oftentimes those are going to be only really minor kind of differences, but it's still interesting to know what to think about that there are so many kind of factors that actually affect whether this one is rotating clockwise or counterclockwise, not just, oh, the curves go in this one direction, so it must be that rotation or something. Or it must be it's just the slider heads being arranged in this way, so that's how the player must rotate or something.